Hi class, and thank you for joining me while I talk a little bit about the book I read for our diversity class called Nickel and Dimed on Not Getting By in America by Barbara Ehrenreich. So one of the reasons I chose this particular book actually was because of the cover art on it. On the cover of this book there's a waitress looking kind of forlorn and trying to figure out sort of what's going on with their life, and I really identified with the cover more than anything else. And after reading sort of the back page of it, I thought this might be a book that really interested me, mostly because I spent almost 7.5 years waiting tables, and I kind of thought to myself, I'd love to hear someone else's perspective about how you wait tables and make a living, or how you work for low wages and make a living, or live off of that. Because while I was a student, I worked as a waitress to help pay my way through school, and I worked as a waitress full-time, like that was my only job. So I did a variety of things, but I thought that this topic in particular would just be really interesting. So a little bit about Barbara Ehrenreich. She has actually a PhD in cellular immunology, but she never became a professor in that field, and she never really did any big research. She's really well known for being an outspoken advocate for a variety of subjects, including healthcare reform, equal wages. She considers herself a feminist, and she says that she became a feminist because of a negative interaction that she had on behalf of her husband, who was a Teamster. She's written about a variety of subjects as well. She's been published numerous times. The book that we're going to discuss today, Nickel and Dimed, is actually her most well-known book. She actually was featured on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart 2 or 3 years ago about a book that she recently published. She's a pretty great public speaker as well, very highly thought of. Just in general about her viewpoints on certain things. She's really not an expert in any one field, and I think that that's actually pretty fascinating about her, is because she's able to put her personal perspective on issues that affect a wide variety of people, and that's kind of what seems to make an audience connect to her. So about Nickel and Dimed. So the whole concept of this book is that Ehrenreich, Barbara, will pose as a low-wage worker. So this book covers 3 different scenarios. She moves to a town with enough money for a down payment on an apartment and kind of startup costs. She doesn't have a lot. She takes basic clothing, no food or anything like that, and she has a car. So then she goes and she finds a job as if she were someone that didn't have any work experience and no education. And she tries to see, 1, if she can find a job, and 2, if she can find housing. Then the end goal is to see, based on that criteria, if at the end of 1 whole month she has enough money to pay for a second month's rent. And that's kind of the end of it. She doesn't stay there longer than a month. She's just there for a month. She's there to work, make her wage, and do her business. Now, we're going to talk about a variety of the jobs that she held, but the big ones that she held that are the main focus of the book are that she was a maid, a waitress, and at the same time that she was a maid, she also worked as a healthcare attendant at a retirement home. And then in the last move that she makes, she works at Walmart. So, Barbara the waitress. Barbara the waitress happens in Key West, Florida. She intentionally stayed very close to home for this one. Barbara's a resident of Florida and has lived there for many years. She didn't want to venture too far out of her comfort zone for this. At this point in time, Barbara's in her mid-40s when she's undergoing this excursion. So she works. So she goes out and she finds a small trailer that she can rent. Okay? It's not as close to town as she would like, but she's able to afford it because she has a car. And cars are important in this scenario because, as she finds out later, a lot of her fellow employees don't have cars. So she works as a waitress for $2 an hour. Now this is in 1998. Something I want you to really think about is students that we work with now, say they're a server or a bartender at a bar, and bartenders are sort of exempt from this rule, but pretty much every waiter or waitress or server, as they're called now, that is a student attending one of our institutions, traditionally they make $2.13 an hour in Texas. And I want you to really think about that. Barbara is working in Key West, Florida for $2.43 an hour in 1998. Think about the difference in the cost of living over the amount of time. I mean, you're really talking about the fact that it's almost been 2 decades since she did this, and servers in Texas are making $2.13 an hour. That's just crazy to me. How are our students expected to get by on such little pay? Because of these low wages, she works in a restaurant that's just really not very busy, and because of these low wages, she's basically just making her hourly amount, and she has to get a second job. Being sleep deprived, so she's working from 2 to 10 at this one job, and before that, she's working another job at another restaurant that's like a buffet style restaurant. Craziness everywhere. There's tourists. It is insanity. And one of the things that she's realizing is that, one, her body just can't keep up with the physical demands of needing to be somewhere at 10 a.m. and then working until 10 p.m. It's physically exhausting. Added to that, she only owns 2 pairs of pants in this scenario. So every other day, she has to do laundry, which is very costly as far as expenses and her personal time. She actually writes that there are several days where she had a hard time taking her notes for the day because she was falling asleep at her computer. So this is where Barbara sort of clues in for the first time that there are hidden costs for being poor. So one of those is not having enough for a security deposit on an apartment means that many people who are working class, making minimum wage, live in motels or hotels, which are much more expensive than an apartment. I mean, you're talking about the difference between paying $450 for a month in an apartment and paying $50 to $60 a night at a hotel, and being dependent upon making at least $50 every night so you have a roof over your head. In fact, one of the waitresses that Barbara works with at the restaurant where she's employed lives in her car, and the manager lets her, their restaurant is attached to a hotel, and the manager of the restaurant lets her go into the hotel and take a shower every day. I mean, and this is commonplace for them. This is nothing out of the ordinary, but Barbara was pretty appalled by it. No apartment means that there's no kitchen, which means that many employees that Barbara's working with only eat cheap fast food and can't afford fresh food, which overall really impacts their health and their endurance in these jobs. No health insurance for these people means that they're basically living off of Tylenol and quick patches. And one of the big concerns for a lot of the people that Barbara ends up working with is that they can't fix an abscessed tooth. They have to let a tooth rot away in their mouth because they can't afford to get it removed. That there's a woman who's pregnant. She doesn't know how she's going to be able to afford to have a baby. Things like that. Small backaches and joint aches that we take for granted that we can go to the doctor to get these looked at. These people have no way to do that. And one other thing is that Barbara says that because of the living situation and needing so much money just to make rent or a down payment, that a lot of times what you end up with is these communes of people who are low-wage workers. So people live with their entire extended family. So you'll see a husband and wife, their children, grandma and grandpa, and maybe a brother or sister, aunt and uncles, that type of thing. And they'll all live in, like one trailer in Key West with no air conditioning. So Barbara actually did make enough money to make rent in Florida, but she quit a job, walked out in the middle of it, but she did have enough money. So Key West ended up being a success for her. Then she moved to Maine. Barbara literally moves to Maine because it's a mostly homogenous society. Maine is almost entirely white. Okay? So Barbara moves to Maine because she feels like there's going to be less competition for her for low-wage jobs, which I think is actually really telling. But the constant bending and lifting and cleaning as part of the maid service is very draining on Barbara. She finds that a lot of times they're having a really hard time. Their backs ache. She literally works for a maid company that says that they will get down on their hands and knees to clean your floor, and she literally does that in every house she visits. One of the big draws for this particular job was supposed to be that there's a 30-minute lunch break, but it turns out that for Barbara, because they have to drive from one house to the next, that lunch break is sort of the drive time between houses, and a lot of times they end up stopping at gas stations and eating a quick bite. Then on top of that, she notices that other low-wage workers look down on them, look down on the maids, and they're constantly viewed with a lot of suspicion. They're almost like low-wage lepers, the lowest of the low wage. And it's a pretty bad experience for Barbara. Again, Barbara was able to make enough money to pay for a second month's rent in this location. However, because she was residing in a tourist town and she was there in the off-season, she sort of determined that she was going to need to save up enough money for 4 months' worth of rent to make it possible for her to live in the same town during the busy season, which she said was just really not reasonable. Then, maybe my favorite, Barbara takes on Walmart. So she moves to Minnesota, really for no other reason than she reads a newspaper article and thinks that might be fun. But she never finds adequate housing. She ends up living in a motel that's super sketchy. She doesn't trust her neighbors. She feels very unsafe, and she lives on nothing but fast food. She takes a certain amount of pride in her job at Walmart, but she feels very isolated because she has limited customer and personnel interaction. And she says that's sort of strategic, that Walmart places people in sort of groups, and those groups don't interact with each other at all. And actually, something that's really interesting is that Barbara tries to get the employees at Walmart to unionize with a little bit of success. Maybe she planted the seeds, but she was pretty proud of that. Now, how that relates to us in higher education. One of the things that's important to realize is that our students come from a variety of socioeconomic backgrounds. For instance, if you have a student who's Pell eligible, something that's important to realize is that their estimated family contribution, or EFC, is basically telling you that they live below the national poverty line. Okay? So I want you to think about that for a second, that what Barbara was living for, the situation Barbara was living in for a month, is something that one of our students could potentially live in for, they've been living in for 18 years, 19 years, 20 years, however long they've been in this situation. So you need to be really, really focused on that, because it doesn't mean just because someone is poor doesn't mean that they don't work hard. It just means that, you know, they haven't had certain advantages sometimes. One of the things that Barbara suffers from, in my opinion, is that she suffers from a sort of intellectual elitism when she talks about the different people that she interacts with. It's almost like she assumes because she has a PhD that she's just naturally more intelligent than people, which is a little alienating for me on a personal level, but she sort of gets over that by the time she gets to Minnesota. She sort of breaks down those barriers and realizes that being successful, and this relates to our students in higher education, being successful is about establishing an academic vocabulary where you work. So for our students, especially our first-gen students, establishing an academic vocabulary is super important. And what I mean by that is we use words like Pell all the time in our profession, but our first-gen students may not know what Pell is. So be careful when you're using new words, and make sure that when you say things like income verification, that your students know exactly what you're talking about. One of the things I really want to hit on is that many of our students, because of the rising cost of college, they work full-time jobs but are considered the working poor. So we need to make sure that we're extra sensitive to students and recognize that not only are they spending hours in the classroom, but they're also working 40 hours, sometimes 50 hours, at jobs that don't pay that much. And they are struggling to literally have enough money to eat. Now, personal reflections. Low-wage jobs are a swirling vortex of doom. It's our job to make sure that our students don't end up in those situations. We've got to be sensitive to our students working low-wage jobs just to get by in school, those nickel and dime type scenarios, and we need to pay attention to the students that we work with, because if they're eligible for work study, then that means that they are particularly prone a lot of time to not having enough resources. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. and I look forward to hearing your reflections.